Welcome everybody to this very special 5x15 event. Let's talk about the blast, which is curated with Voices4Lebanon. Tonight we will be hearing from our exceptional panel as they share their perspectives and stories with a focus on arts, architecture, activism, and civil society, all coming to us live from around the world. You can tweet us at 5x15 stories at Voices4Lebanon, and I'll put the details in the chat. There's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screens, and you can put your questions in there for our speakers, and we're going to try to get to as many as we can towards the end of the session. And I will be following up with a call to action and a list of organizations that can be supported after the event. So I hope that that will be of interest, and this will be an inspirational session. I will be disappearing into the virtual wings and handing over to our very capable and brilliant host, Awa Damon. And I wanted to thank Awa for being such a huge support for this event and all the preparation that's gone into getting this ready. She's a multi-award winning senior international correspondent at CNN, and she's based at the Istanbul Bureau. She graduated from college with degrees in biology and French, so she wasn't always clear exactly what path she would take. She started working in a Turkish textile company in New York, and she was there when 9/11 happened, which sparked her interest in the growing divide between the Arab Muslim world on the one side and the America and the West on the other. She decided to go into journalism and has since devoted her career to understanding how we interact with each other and the human sides of the news events that she covers, from the Iraq War to the Arab Spring to ISIS and the war in Syria. She has also founded her own charity, which is called the International Network for Aid, Relief and Assistance, which is based on her personal experience in war zones and witnessing children who need medical assistance that they can't access. She's a huge supporter, and she's been a fantastic spirit as we've developed this program. And I want to thank her very, very much. And I want to hand over to her now. Welcome, Awa.
Thank you so much, Daisy. It's a complete pleasure for me to be here. And yeah, I know, as Daisy was saying, a lot of this is very personal. My dad's American, my mom's Syrian. I grew up very cross-cultural, and Beirut holds a very special place for me. This is an oversimplification of the country's long and tortured history. But I wanted to start off by giving a bit of background on Beirut and on Lebanon. I mean, look, Beirut is the sort of a city that was once known as the Paris of the Middle East, but went through a bitter civil war that lasted from 1975 to 1990 that was fueled by internal and external factors. And that ended up leaving the country deeply divided, largely along sectarian lines, with a constitution that handicapped it pretty much along those sectarian divides. So you have a president who is Christian, the prime minister is a Sunni Muslim, the speaker of parliament is a Shia. But despite all of that, and what is so captivating about a place like Lebanon, or has been for so long, is that there was always this joie de vivre, this exuberant enjoyment of life among the population. And it's something that a lot of Lebanese really take great pride in, this reputation that they have of nothing is going to bring them down, of they'll survive, they're beautiful. And so in 2003, when I started my career in journalism, I was working out of Iraq. I was based in CNN's Baghdad bureau, and my parents had just moved to Lebanon. And so for me, that was perfect, because I would travel out of the horror that was war into the embrace of Beirut, the city where it is all too easy to escape out of that bubble of war into the Beirut bubble of we're fine, we're beautiful. And it's this bubble that has really been crafted over the decades by Lebanese and by expats. And it's also a city and a people that knew war, and they know emotional tornadoes. So I didn't have to explain myself to my friends. They just got it. And back then, it really did seem as if, Lebanon might be morphing into something more than this created illusion that has charmed so many. More and more young Lebanese were returning to build their lives, to invest in their own country. But then 2005 happened with the assassination of former Prime Minister Eliafi, and everything just shattered again and spiraled downwards. And since then, it's really been blow after blow after blow. And even though the Lebanese spirit has still persisted, it's been growing darker. And I notice it because now I'm not living there anymore. I go back and I visit, and each trip back, I feel as if Beirut and Lebanon and the people are growing more haggard. The Lebanese spirit is feeling more faded and exhausted. And it's those same sectarian dynamics of the years of war that, coupled with this rampant corruption and repetitive government incompetence, that have led to Lebanon today, the tragedy of Lebanon today, in complete and total near economic collapse. And then, of course, the Beirut Blast, which is a blast and an event of such magnitude. I think, for outsiders and for Lebanese alike, it's very difficult for people to wrap their minds around what it is that they actually went through and how it is that it was even allowed to happen. And of course, that is why we're here tonight, to talk about the blast and how, through different sectors and through our amazing panelists who are all fighting on multiple and different fronts to try to change the narrative in Lebanon and finally put the country on the course that its population actually deserves it to be. So with that being said, thank you again, everyone, for joining us. And I would like to introduce our first guest, Hashem Sarkis, who is a renowned architect, educator, and scholar. And he is also the Dean of School of Architecture and Planning at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, where he's been since 2015. And his work, and I found this quite striking when I was speaking to him, is inspired by Beirut, by the Beirut state of mind, this state of chaos, of thriving on chaos, vitality, this almost inexplicable blend of beauty and ugliness, a city that's always on the brink of something bad or good. And he was telling me that he translates that into architecture by designing for the unpredictable, by creating buildings that allow for the framework of possibility rather than the dictating of spaces. And so with that, Hashem, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Arwa. Thank you, 5x15. Arwa introduced me, but she did not introduce my nose. I just had a septoplasty, so I apologize for the bandage. Recentering Beirut. The center of the August 4 explosion near the grain silo in the Beirut harbor was about 1 kilometer from Martyrs Square, the symbolic center of Beirut. If the Martyrs Square statue became the symbol of the reconstruction of the 1990s, the silo will no doubt become the symbol of the reconstruction to come. This shift of center is more than symbolic. I would like to propose that it carries with it a potential for connecting the city with its vitality. This displacement of 1 kilometer is a result of a sum total of 1 million other small displacements that took place on that ominous day. We all heard the scale of damage and death can be explained by an overlap of 2 explosions that happened seconds apart, which also caused an earthquake and a pressure bomb. However, the thousands of lives that were spared as a result of the lag between the 2 bombs and between the forewarning signals sent by a shaking earth before the pressure waves did their damage. Perhaps there is already a writer at work interviewing all those who survived a falling glass panel, or because they felt the earth move and ran inside, or because they tucked under the table and lived to tell of the horrors of what they saw when they crawled back out. These million miracles deserve to be carefully chronicled, because they give this epic cloud and its apocalyptic colors much, much more scale. Together, these stories also describe very graphically the geography of Beirut. Beirut operates really like an amphitheater. The explosion, the harbor being the stage, and then the 2 surrounding hills of Beirut amplifying its effect like an amphitheater. The closer you were, the less warning, the less time you had between the tremors and the waves. However, there were so many factors that played into this. between the orientation of the buildings, the age of the buildings, what people usually did at 6 p.m., and luck. Luck distorts everything. It has no distinct geography, no predictable measure between death and escaping it. When the explosion happened, the silo created an off-centering, one that protected the downtown and western side more than the eastern side. In that sense, the explosion then tells the story of a city that could possibly be once again in front of the opportunity of recentering itself. Now, for the past 30 years, Beirut has been intent on building a new city center where the civil war had created most damage, in the downtown. Even if that center had arguably already been displaced to many other places, to Ras Beirut in the 60s and 70s, and to tens of little centers around the city during the war. There were many bad moves associated with the reconstruction efforts of the 1990s. One of them was the unfortunate dissociation of the downtown from the harbor. Historically, Beirut has always flowed from the harbor. Goods arrived there, guests stayed at caravanserais by the water, and these goods would flow themselves through customs up to the souks where the residents would receive them. The pulse of Beirut's life was set by ships, visitors, and quarantines. Till today, more than 3/4 of the goods that come to Lebanon come through the harbor, but they no longer set the pulse of the city. It is not easy to replicate the old connection that the harbor had with the city, but it is still a very vital employer, surrounded by residential areas, transportation networks, and with a strong visibility and connectivity to the country and the region. Now, it is also not unusual for cities to lose their centers or for their centers to shift. Cities do that all the time. New York does it, London does it. Beirut, as I mentioned, has done it several times. If anything, the explosion has brought the harbor back into the picture, both as a site of disaster, but also as a site of opportunity. It is inevitably shifting the center of the city's efforts to rebuild and shifting its imagination to include, even if by accident, its most viable economic region. Now, look at this map of destruction, but also think of the following possibilities as we strive to rebuild this area, and maybe to rebuild it not like it is. The infrastructure that blocks the harbor, like the Shah Al-Hulu garage and the highway, could now be opened up to reconnect it back with the city. A light rail can easily traverse from Baye all the way to downtown, across the harbor. The first and second basins that are between the downtown and the harbor can be reopened and connect to the business center. The Karantina dump, sewage stations, and gas harbor are major sources of pollution, could be rethought as part of a comprehensive public health plan. And above all, the isolated residential areas behind the harbor, Marm Khayel and others, can be revitalized by this connectedness without losing their identity as the downtown did, and hopefully without losing their population. A bold recentering of Beirut bodes well for any further thinking about the city's planning and that of Lebanon. It will connect with the vital cultural and economic future of the country. It will shift from a center focused on static real estate within Beirut's boundaries to a center linked more effectively with the economy, to the adjacent neighborhoods, and to regional and global networks that importantly reinvigorate the identity of Beirut as a port city. The new center may be only 1 kilometer away, but it promises to propel the city light years ahead. Peace.
Thank you, Hashem. I can only say that I really do hope that your vision of reconstruction is the one that does materialize. Our next speaker is Sara El-Yafi, who is a political activist. And I just found out today, her grandfather was one of the founding fathers of Lebanon, who actually gave voting rights to women, was a former prime minister. Interestingly, though, Sada herself grew up in an apolitical household and said that up until she was 16 was not really aware of the political dynamics surrounding Lebanon until she picked up a book that changed her life called 50 Years of War. And upon reading that book, she found herself asking people around her, how can you sleep at night when there is so much injustice happening every day and everywhere? That questioning got her into political science and then on to the Kennedy School where, fun fact, she actually went with my sister that I also just found out today. And that trajectory got her where she is today, fighting for justice on multiple fronts. Sada, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to ask everybody, I saw the number earlier, 430 participants right now, along with the guests. If you could please close your eyes with me for just 5 seconds. And would you please think of the people who have deeply cared about you in your life? People who have basically loved you into being. A few seconds of contemplation. I think the people you're thinking about, that you chose to think about, are predominantly those that gave really deep meaning to your life. And life does well to put them in our path because somewhere they wish to keep us out of harm's way. So I'd like you to hold them in that space and walk with me for a bit as I talk to you about 2 different stories before I delve into what I really want to tell you. Here is a story, and it's not my story. So the moment after the explosion, I'm holding the hand of my 3-year-old daughter and watching a fire in the port of Beirut from our living room window, and which is across from the port. I'm unsure what to do, but then I hear planes, or I thought I heard planes, because it's a claim that's been corroborated by thousands and thousands of survivors of the August 4 explosion, but hasn't been corroborated by any evidence per se. But the planes that I'm hearing are loud. And if they're loud, from my own experience, I know that it means that they're flying low. Because I've lived and I've survived the Lebanese Civil War, and I know what I'm supposed to do when planes fly this low. I have to run to the center of the apartment, usually the hallway, away from the sides of the building in order to protect myself from any blast. Differently from the Civil War, this time I am not alone. I have my 3-year-old daughter with me. So I ask her to run in front of me to the hallway. And as we are running, the explosion occurs. And we are caught in the extreme channels of what we understand today are blast waves, channeled in a narrow corridor. In hindsight, actually, it's apparent that more people seem to have survived by staying in the main rooms of the apartments rather than those who, as per the Civil War rules, ran to the hallways for protection. It seems that this explosion was different from all the explosions I once knew as a child. Does every explosion have its own directives? I didn't know the directives to the largest non-nuclear explosion in the world. I broke all my ribs, glass shard punctured my body, and my daughter died. Here's another story. The moment after the explosion, I try to help a devastated mother find her 29-year-old missing son. She and her other son have been frantically looking for him all night long, going from hospital to hospital frantically and getting turned away at the door because of how crazy that night was. Forcefully turned away due to the madness of what this explosion had incurred. Now they're standing outside of a hospital, pleading at 3 a.m., almost sure that the son and the brother, basically the same person, is in there. I find out about the case from my own brother, who's friends with the 2 sons. I end up calling the head of the ER, who's a contact of mine, and he says, send me his picture. I'll take care of it at 7:30 a.m. as soon as I'm back. These 4.5 hours will be the longest 4.5 hours of this mother's life. At 7:30 a.m. on the dot, I call the doctor. Good news, he says. The morgue technician reverted back. The young man you're looking for is not in the morgue. Thank goodness. I relay the news to the mother and to the brother, and probably they've experienced maybe the deepest relief that they've ever felt in their entire life. I tell them that the doctor will keep looking for their son, for her son, for his brother, in other hospitals through an internal ER network, and they'll circulate his picture. They're so grateful, and they say this sentence that I think I will never forget in my life. By the way, he has a beard now. He's clean shaven in the picture, but he has a beard now. And it's like a brick had hit my throat, because I know that the beard makes a difference. The beard definitely makes a difference. So I call the head of the ER again, and I say, I plead with him, please check again. And he said he will personally go to the morgue. And 10 minutes later, he calls me and he says, this is an experienced person who knows exactly how to deal with these situations. Get me the strongest member of the family to talk to. I'm so sorry, your friend is in the morgue. That story is my story. I am the person who tried to help them find their missing member of family. The one before is one of many stories that have been recounted to me. And this is not another day in the Middle East. I didn't expect to get emotional. Wow, I didn't expect that.
Take the time you need, Sada. I mean,
No, but anyway.
What Lebanon has been through is just.
This is the largest non-nuclear explosion in the history of the world. And it's a crime against all humanity. And it is not a Lebanese problem, this is a human problem. It's true that the Lebanese people have been forced to live in a world where so many powerful parties profit from their murder while just shrugging away any concern for their constant misery. But I have not found anything as dehumanizing as the rush of the media and world powers to so easily brush off this explosion as an accident and move on to callous politicking. The Lebanese people, for your information, are the 4th most educated nation in math and sciences in the world, as per the World Economic Forum's 2018 Global Competitiveness Report. These Lebanese people today are stuck between a rock and a hard place. Decimated, bankrupted, homeless, victims of the worst financial, economic, and monetary crisis that the contemporary world has ever witnessed, caused by an autocratic, oligarchic, and psychopathic regime that magically manages to never lose its blessings from foreign powers, all of whom have joined forces together in a seemingly invisible deal to cajole the Lebanese people into submission through hopelessness. We are gaslighted about the planes we heard. We are gaslighted about scientific methodologies that we are exhaustively positing in our attempt to advocate that this was quite possibly not just an unlucky accident. We are babied by foreign presidents, ridiculed as conspiracy theorists for countering the corrupt government's narrative of an accident, a corrupt government that has forcibly turned us, Lebanese people, into beggars, constantly appealing to foreigners for donations, which has become the only way for the wide majority of the Lebanese people to ensure basic survival. But it does not end there. It does not end there, and this is what I want to say, that it begins here. It begins here. So to tangibly answer 5x15 and Voices for Lebanon's request, and thank you so much for this, for proposing possible ways forward. We are going to pursue justice. There are killer details in the story of the ship and the story of ammonium nitrate that implicate many different actors that will be pursued in the International Court of Law with irrefutable evidence of crime. While this Russian-owned Roses ship was indeed transporting ammonium nitrate on board of its, by the way, Moldovan blacklisted flag of convenience ship. Every Moldovan ship is actually blacklisted. The ship was supposed to take the ammonium nitrate from Batumi, Georgia to Mozambique, to a company called FEM, Fábrica de Explosivos Mozambique. It is now known that the reason that this ship docked in Beirut is because it was called upon by specific entities in Lebanon. You heard me correctly. Specific entities called upon the ship to dock in Lebanon because they needed to perform a trade deal on board of that ship. Such a decision is at best an illegal act ridden with complete negligence, which is punishable by law. And at worst, it's a participation to a conspiracy to bring this ship and the ammonium nitrate to Lebanon, in which case it is also punishable by law. Those who derouted the ship and made it change its course and had it come to Lebanon will have to answer to the court of law. Who convinced them? Who pressured them? Who incentivized them? Yeah, there are names. There are institutions. We know them. There is more than enough ground for a very strong, powerful international case against several defendants and major plaintiffs who have suffered enormous damage are already prepared to be summoned for this case. And there are 2 international law firms that are on board. This is not just Sarah daydreaming at midnight in her bedroom. The importance of this case is that this will serve as a model for justice around the world. Because everywhere in the world, people are under the impression that if higher powers are at play, then citizens of the world are rendered powerless and forced to accept sociopathic hands that have been dealt to them. Well, not this time. And I will talk later when you come back to me with a question about exactly how this is going to go about. But I would like you, before I leave you, to think again of the people that you thought about at the beginning of my talk, who have cared about you and wanted what was best for you in your life. If it is uncomfortable for you to imagine them in this place, then this is a quest for justice for you too. If you would want power and justice to be served to you and to your loved ones, then it is worth it to understand that this is a plea of justice on your behalf as well. So we will be partners. And to those saying that they're already starting to kill witnesses and whistleblowers, well, guess what? They cannot kill 4 million people, even if they have tried. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I don't think there's anyone listening right now who isn't really feeling like they're punched in the gut. The level of, emotion, justified passion. I think, I'm very familiar with trauma, having covered war for so long, but it's very different to see trauma on the faces of people you know when you see how it actually physically alters their features. And this is something that Lebanon has been going through for way, way, way too long. Our next speaker, our next guest, is Maya Ibrahimchah, who also knows the pain that Lebanon can dish out to those who sadly love it most. She's the founder and the president of Beit el Baraka, which means House of the Blessed. And at this charity's core, and I really loved this idea, is that it's not a charity for charity's sake, but it's a restoration of dignity to those who have been deprived of their most basic needs and rights. And Maya, before we get into exactly what it is and how it is that Beit el Baraka goes about achieving these goals, I just wanted to ask you about your own childhood in the midst of Lebanon's civil war. What did your defining moments end up being?
First of all, Arwa, it's going to be very difficult to talk after Sarah's very emotional speech. I'm having a difficult time concentrating because I want to pay a special tribute to my sister-in-law, Marion, who was killed in the blast, and we've named a big section of Beit el Baraka's premises in her memory. So we all feel the pain of what's going on today. And unfortunately, the problem is that these are recurring emotions that we've been feeling for the past 40 years, mixed with a lot of corruption, a lot of democratization of things that should not happen. We'll talk about this later. The do's and don'ts of the Lebanese society, who is supposed to be held responsible for most of the problems we're having today. But first, let's talk about where I grew up. So I grew up in Lebanon, in Beirut. I lived the civil war just like everybody else. It just taught me to be a bit stronger. I had a very big advantage of having a German mother who had a German upbringing from her mother. So basically, I was taught to respect the environment, to respect the limits of others. And the most important thing was to never accept corruption and people who did things that were not by the book. So this is probably what gave me the basis of doing what I'm doing today.
And in terms of Beit el Baraka itself, like what was that moment where you decided I'm actually going to take action and create something like this?
It was a time in my life where I was completely disconnected from any charity work because my focus was entirely on preserving heritage homes. And this is something I was mentioning before. I actually have a couple of friends here, Sarah and Gregory. Together we fought a lot and we're still fighting and we're always going to fight to protect heritage. And then one day, it was during a time I was refurbishing an abandoned palace. I met a beautiful woman who was on the streets. She was a teacher, a French teacher, retired. And the problem is she had lost her home. She had lost everything she had because she went on retirement. I met her twice, so I decided to stop and talk to her. The second time I saw her, I understood that there was something wrong. And she explained to me what were the problems of going on retirement in Lebanon. There are no pension plans. There's nothing for people to eat. There's no way to get medicine. There's no way to pay rent. They're basically left on the streets. So I took her in and we decided to start visiting her friends. And I realized that her friends are exactly living in the same way she was. We visited a lot of intellectuals who were living on just a little bit of bread and whatever their neighbors would give them. Most of them had no electricity for 6 to 8 years. No electricity, I'm not saying no generator. It's literally no light in their house. I was outraged by all this, outraged. And at the same time, it was a period during which I was constantly being invited to all these fancy parties where you had feathered women hanging from the ceiling and bands flying in from the four corners of the planet to come and perform. Whereas the minimum wage in Lebanon could not even cover a month's rent. So I was devastated by all this. And this is when I decided to do something about it. And I opened the first free supermarket of Lebanon. It's a point-based supermarket where people can come in with their cards and shop for whatever they need, because they were not the type of people that you would just randomly give a box of food to and say, you're going to eat this. They were so amazing, so superior to most of the people I ever knew. So I wanted to give them their dignity back by giving them choice, because choice is dignity. You just choose whatever you want and nobody has the right to say anything. And so from the supermarket, the need started growing. So we decided to start planting. We are covering today 500,000 square meters of organic agriculture in 3 different areas. And in these areas, rural areas, we're empowering women a lot because we're trying to create our own brand. Besides from the fruits and vegetables that you can see now, and all the dairy products that we have, we produce 150 kilograms of dairy products a day. So all these things are produced by women in rural areas that we're trying to strengthen and empower as much as possible. And then from the supermarket came the idea of giving these people some medical help, because the biggest problem is that we were seeing them come into our supermarket most of the time sick, with no access to any sort of medicine or medical treatments. So we have now a big number of people who are undergoing chemotherapy, who have heart surgeries, We've changed so many teeth, eye surgeries, etc. And from there on, we started our third department, and this was a blessing in disguise because we opened a department of architecture and engineering to revamp the houses of most of our beneficiaries. And thank God we started in 2019 because this gave us the opportunity today of immediately going on site and having 16 different teams of contractors who are working with us to repair 3,011 homes. And we just exceeded 300 small businesses that we fully revamp, repair, and restock even. We are currently taking on a little bit more because 3,011 apartments were what we had decided to repair initially. But then the problem is that when it first rained a few weeks ago, a lot of NGOs disappeared because they were no longer able to work. First of all, there's no funding coming properly. The funding is all private. It's done by SEAL, by Impact Lebanon, and by Life mostly. So we're very, very short on cash. If it weren't for these three NGOs, we wouldn't have money at all, I think. And the second problem is that I think most of these NGOs were, first of all, launched because they had very good intentions of helping rebuild their country, but then they saw the magnitude of the disaster it was, and then when it rained, houses started collapsing, and then most of them disappeared. So I think our 3,011 homes are definitely going to double by the end of December. So our budget is going to double as well, and we're very far from reaching our budget. And the fourth department is education. So we also decided to have an education department for the simple reason that 1 in 4 students is not going to school this year in Lebanon. And just like Sarah said, we are a knowledge-based country. We are a country that exported mines, and we are a country that formed other countries that are now banning us. So it is very insulting for us to see that today we have to beg other governments for funds to teach our kids. So we have taken on thousands of families, and we are going to continue this fight, and we are not going to lose it, that's for sure.
And for our listeners and viewers who don't necessarily understand what Lebanon's economic crisis means, again, I'm going to oversimplify it, but let me just put it this way. When I went in August to cover the aftermath of the explosion, a meal that would have normally cost me about, say, the equivalent of $3 was, with the official Lebanese exchange rate, about $35. So basically, if you're Lebanese and you're not making US dollars, which obviously most Lebanese are not, and therefore you are not able to exchange your US dollars on the black market, your money is worth significantly less than a quarter of what it used to be. Yes. And this is why there are so many warnings about the humanitarian catastrophe that is coming, and one that is highly preventable. And Maya, when we were talking, you'd also talked about this correlation between Beit el Baraka and corruption. Can you re-elaborate on that for me, please?
Beit el Baraka is the result of corruption. Beit el Baraka is the result of the revolution. Beit el Baraka was born from the Thawra, although we started Beit el Baraka in February and then the revolution started in October, but it was a gut feeling I had that something was going to happen and that the country was going to explode. I mean, any idiot would have understood this. So this is what's amazing, is that none of the people in power had even any idea that this was going to happen. And they were still taxing us, and they were still, it felt like the 15th century when you had these lords who would come in and tax the peasants. I mean, it's the same mind frame. Our leaders are still living there. They're in the 15th century. So everything the civil society is doing today is the revolution. The revolution changed. It's no longer about just going down to the Riyadh Salah Square and then holding a flag. Now it's actually holding a broom, holding a hammer, getting to work, because by working, there are two things that we're doing that are very important. First of all, we're showing the people that you do not need to be at the mercy of these warlords. This is the first thing. I think even warlords is a compliment to them. These are just pure criminals who are there. Ever since 1975, they've been there, they have killed people, and they're still doing this. They have killed 200 people now with this explosion, and they are held responsible because all of them knew that there were 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate in silo number 12. And everybody knows what silo number 12 is and who it belongs to and what's going on there. So they are all in it. Ever since 2013 or 14, they all knew. So they are all responsible. So the first thing that we're doing is we are trying to show people, especially the Lebanese voters, that everything you need to live a decent life should not be bargained for with politicians. Because in Lebanon, unfortunately, what the deputies and the ministers do, the majority of them, is they starve you, and they starve you so bad that you reach a point where you become a slave to them. And then when you're starved enough, they will give you 1 box of food per month and tell you, this is a box, I'm taking care of you, vote for me, please. So we have currently now managed to assemble a database that comprises 226,000 Lebanese voters to whom we are giving food. And we have papers inside that explain that food is a human right and not a tool that yields votes. And we are working a lot on this, and we have sessions with people. We go to villages and we explain to them, we go to rural areas and explain to them that they should not be at the mercy of politicians for these things. The second thing that we are doing is that we are making it not okay to be friends with dirty politicians. It is not okay to host parties for people who stole money. It is not okay to have lunch with the wife of a politician simply because she's the wife of a politician and she's rich. These things used to be a habit, unfortunately, in Lebanon, and this is what led us to where we are today, because everything was okay. We used to have big events and big parties in the honor of Mr. and Mrs., whereas Mr. and Mrs. had stolen like $1 billion from public funds. Beit el Baraka is very keen on constantly reminding everyone that we do not take funds or donations from any politician who stole public funds. We don't. We are cleaning their mess. We're not cleaning their conscience.
Thank you. We're going to go back and readdress some of these, core issues when it comes to how Lebanon does manage to clean itself up. But I want to get to our next panelist, Gregory Bouchardjian, who is a visual artist and art historian, and along the same lines of what Maya was talking about, very passionate about protecting Lebanon's heritage. And I've seen a couple of your photographs, Gregory, and I know you have some to share with us. It's just amazing the way that you capture the layers of the intensity of what is actually Lebanon and Beirut. So I will just throw it over to you right away.
Good evening. Thank you very much for this beautiful presentation. Thank you for this event. I would start by saying that I have the feeling, and after I heard my colleagues, that all our lives we have been picking up the pieces. So now we are picking up the pieces of the explosion that came up into a crisis that I won't speak about because my colleagues already introduced it. Before that, we had a period of reconstruction that didn't go in the good direction. Before that, we have 15 years of war, and so on, and so on, and so on. This year, we are supposed to celebrate the centenary of the Greater Lebanon, the state of Lebanon, that was born after a famine during World War I. So it's like if for more than a century, this country is trying to go up and to build something, and then it collapses. And it's like the myth of Sisyphus. And I really had this feeling of the myth of Sisyphus when a few days after the explosion, a mutual friend of Maya and I, Camille Tarazi, brought me into the old mansions of Beirut and showed me the devastation. And we were walking in the rubble. and I was in these opulent old buildings that have the heritage of Beirut. So here you see me in a picture taken by another friend, Georges Boustani, in the Surso Palace, which is one of Beirut's most iconic buildings. It's in the library of this palace. Ceiling had completely collapsed, and seeing this house that had already endured war in the 80s, seeing this house in this condition, seeing the whole neighborhood in this condition, I'm not going to say it was terrible because it's so obvious, but I have lived 15 years of war. I was a kid when the war started. I saw Beirut being destroyed. I saw Beirut city center completely shattered. My family lost our home. We had to move. We became refugees in somewhere else. And this story led me to be obsessed with the story of Beirut, its heritage. And for years, I have been working on the abandoned houses of Beirut, as you said in this picture. So this specific house is a house that is very dear to Maya because it is a house that was built in the 19th century. It's a very impressive house. And it has been abandoned since the 1970s. And 2 years ago, this house that was in this very poor condition, Maya Ibrahimchah organized a beautiful event, and she revived it. And this event coincided with another event, which was my exhibition at Surso Museum about the abandoned houses. And so it was in December 2018, and there was such a beautiful feeling to see this old house, this abandoned house that was living again. And for me, doing this exhibition at Surso Museum, where there were pictures, there was a video that you see a screenshot of it, in which we were manipulating objects and archive from these houses. This is a picture taken inside the museum. So at this time, I was feeling that we were starting to recover something, to picking up the pieces, as I said it previously, and that there was a way of coming back home to find back our city, to reappropriate our city. And then a year later, there was a revolt, and then the economic collapse, and then the explosion. And Surso Museum that appears in this picture where my exhibition took place was destroyed. And so this is this Sisyphean thing. And now we have to go on. And what is very impressive is that people are going on. You go walking in the neighborhood of Madam Khayil, and you see so many buildings that have been already repaired or are in course of reparation. And some initiatives, one of these initiatives is Suq Tayyib, which is a market of organic producers that moved in an old garage in Madam Khayil. So this was one of the most devastated neighborhoods that is living again. And these are the kind of things that we need, alongside with all the humanitarian initiatives like Beit el Baraka, which is doing a great work, so that people can keep going on. And we need to keep going on. We need to keep working as artists, as researchers, or as humanitarians, as whatever we are doing to try to resist, to stay here and to keep this country alive. It's very challenging, it's very difficult, and we are trying our best. I don't know if we will succeed, but I hope so.
I hope so too. And frankly, as long as people like all of you keep fighting, I know it's very, very difficult, but hopefully for the better. Our final guest is Yazan Harwani, who has been described as the Banksy of Beirut. I don't know how you feel about that, but you can.
Not great.
So from our previous correspondence, Yazan was telling me that he discovered his passion for art when he was in the school bus, and he'd be staring out the window and he was constantly perplexed by this paradox of an urban landscape that didn't really look like the people living in it. Because when you drive through basically Beirut or most of Lebanon, you've got huge walls that are just plastered with all sorts of posters of, various different politicians. It's everywhere. And so he wanted to try to figure out how he could paint over all of these, all of those. And these days his artwork is kind of more of an outlet to try to make sense of the world and try to deconstruct, I guess you'll phrase it better than I will, but how to deconstruct the normalization of the abnormal when it comes to Lebanon.
Yes, exactly. Can you hear me?
Yes, go right ahead.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Arwa. Thanks a lot for everyone for inviting me to this platform. I feel honored to kind of share my story and reflection from like I have never seen the Civil War, and maybe like my perspective is slightly different than how I reflect on what's happening today. But I try to kind of reflect on Lebanon through my own personal artwork and also kind of my own experience. I was personally born, after the 1990s, which is the time basically where the Civil War, the armed Civil War, had stopped. But although like most people agree this is when kind of the Civil War had ended, I think in hindsight it's just got institutionalized, where the warlords of the Civil War had created a new profitable business model for themselves by creating a power sharing agreement. They just hijacked the government, and the state became more or less a vehicle for them to kind of fund their clientelist system and reap the profits in an operationally just much easier way than actually having leading battle in and to profit from chaos. And like you were saying, Arwa, my school driver actually made the unfortunate choice when designing the route to pick me first on the journey, which meant I would have to do 45 minutes to get to the school, which is like 10 minutes away, going through the streets of Beirut. And where I had a lot of time to kind of reflect and look and enjoy, the gray, bullet-riddled urban landscape. And what I was really perplexed by the fact that the urban landscape was completely devoid of the natural expression of culture, the real opinion, the hopes and the dreams of the people of the city. The politicians honestly had beaten me to street art and had monopolized the expression in the public spaces by imposing their pictures and sometimes, posting even some extra militiamen on the corners of the streets to assert their dominance. They had dominated the urban landscape so well that some people would say, oh, this area of Beirut is, the property of X political party or Z political party or X. Not necessarily because of real representation or actual ownership or political representation, but rather because that political party was just so effective at using a minority of people that were part of this clientelist system and imposing their colors, pictures, lots of flags and monuments in that specific area. And by doing so, they used to be able to monopolize the opinion and the expression of the space and create some sort of political hegemony that allows them to kind of, milk the state and impose what they want, although they were a minority. And this is where, like in the school bus, I used to remember the paradox between, the very rich cultural layer of the people of Lebanon with the very bland urban landscape and something did not make sense. So when I was 16, I did not think through my actions, and I just one day decided I'm going to go in the streets, I'm going to pull out some posters, I'm going to clean up and then just start painting. I used to think it's illegal, but then I discovered that the police officers, if you talk to them, and if you tell them what the work is about, they'll be like, you know what, we'll let you paint. So basically, I noticed the cops don't care. My mom did not find out, and I decided to kind of do this. And my obsession since then has become, how do you make the city's public spaces look more like its inhabitants? And to be completely frank, I really don't know still, but I try to do things. The first step is trying to correct the dominance of the political parties in those public spaces. And basically what I tried to do since that day on is basically try to replace those figures and those posters with more consensual people, such as people who actually roamed the streets of Beirut, singers, actors, poets, people that sold flowers or just roamed the streets. I wanted to make the streets a diary of the actual people, not necessarily instead of the warlords. And this is kind of this famous of this mural of Sabah, which was inspired by a shop owner's memories of blasting her music on the street corner right there just before the Civil War in what is called, the Golden Era. And this is kind of the same kind of mural with Saad Hariri in the back, the ex-prime minister, again with this juxtaposition of trying to occupy the space, exert cultural hegemony to kind of exert that political power by imposing themselves. This is not a consensual representation of what the people want to see on those walls. And as I grew up, I moved from the identity of the city to try to focus on the identity of the people and the nation, to try to tackle the elements in our identity that are most problematic. For example, today, Lebanon, like Gregory was saying, celebrates its 100-year anniversary. But the initial design of Lebanon was in part a reaction to the Great Famine, like Gregory was mentioning, which led to the death and migration of almost a third of the Lebanese people back then. And this event was quasi-erased from public memory. People don't remember it, and there is no public memorial for it. And what's interesting about the design of Lebanon is that it was supposed to be to avoid the repetition of a famine. So this is why when they designed it, they included, the coast to allow for import and export, the Bekaa Valley to create agriculture so that we avoid kind of a great famine. And 100 years later, this has failed because of the lack of economic and political leadership that we are still kind of riddled with today. And this memorial that you're seeing on the screen is a memorial for the famine. It's the first memorial for the famine, which actually the sentences, and it's a tree made out of sentences of people who used to live during the event. These people are mentioning stuff that are very similar to what we see today. It is sentences of people describing the famine, the bad logistics, the monopoly on food. Some of this monopoly was done by religious institutions such as the church. The regional power struggle that led to this migration, which is exactly the same thing that is repeating itself today. 100 years later, we're still at square one. And this is why during my travels personally, I used to always document the pictures of the airport, which became the only economic pillar of Lebanon because it exports the only one thing that Lebanon is really good at doing, which is young people that are professionals that can work outside and send back money inside, which became kind of the economic model of Lebanon, which creates this very paradoxical identity to people like myself and many of the young people that have had to leave, were pushed out of the country, where the national identity is paradoxically defined by being outside of the nation. But this thing has been normalized and is not discussed even enough. And this is why my current work actually focuses exactly on this, showing this chaos, everything that has been normalized, that we have accepted as, great, we speak multiple languages. We've created the myth of the phoenix and of the successful immigrant to normalize all of those things, which are completely not normal. And the name of the series, which is due to be exhibited soon, is Perhaps the Moon is Beautiful, but it is Far, which described our paradoxical relationship with Lebanon. What I find interesting about this image is that this is the image that people use, that migrants use to announce that they have returned back to Lebanon, especially during the holiday days such as Christmas. And it is the fact that it is culturally ubiquitous, that people have seen it so many times, is symptomatic of our century-long turmoil in Lebanon. The fact that we always have this migrant culture that has been normalized. But to end on a positive note, I think my favorite part of this painting and this image is its ambiguity. I think today, it is a sign of the young people leave. What I like about it, it's ambiguous. I hope that in the future, it would become a symbol of the people that are coming back once and for all, and to come back to Lebanon and to make Lebanon their homeland forever. This business model of Lebanon, which is like exporting people and accepting indifference towards the political status quo. I think we need to kind of change the symptoms and the root causes that have led to those symptoms, reject the indifference so that we don't find ourselves, because what we're seeing today is a repetition of the Great Famine 100 years later. It is exactly the same thing happening on the 20th century. We should reject indifference so that in 100 years, we don't find ourselves again in square one. Thank you. You're on mute, Arwa.
I just did the same thing I've been warning everyone not to do. I mean, classic, right? But thank you, Yazan. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate your artwork. And, you know, on that point of what you were talking about, I wanted to open this up for a question that I'll first direct at Sarah. So, you know, as an outsider, but also as a journalist, I felt that, you know, over the years, there have been these, you know, moments in time where it felt as if, you know, Lebanon might actually be, because of, you know, demonstrations or revolutions or whatever you want to call it, you know, beginning to move the needle towards the change that you're all talking about. And yet there's that barrier. And for some reason, the country's never able to break that barrier. I mean, Sarah, what needs to happen now? Because how much more can you all take?
Actually, that's really an excellent question. I'm going to actually answer that basing myself on an empirical study and some history to get really straight to the point and not keep it on the emotional. There is a reason why revolutions have been alarmingly rare on our planet. It is actually estimated that in the 20th and the 21st century, the cumulative number of revolutions that happened in those, like the 21st century is still ongoing, but in that 120 years equals the number of revolutions that have occurred on the planet over the course of the past 3,400 years. And that answers, that sort of feeds into your question. Why are there so many barriers to people instilling change, right? And the reason is human beings adapt so much to callousness and poverty. And it is the contrary of what we like to believe, that poverty drives people to the street and woes drive people to the street. It's the opposite. The poorer, the more catastrophic your situation, the more your mouth's going to be shut. So I will give you the answer immediately. And actually, I will be giving an in-depth talk on this very soon. What needs to happen at every course in time when a revolution took place? And when I say revolution, I don't mean a demonstration. I mean a revolution that has uprooted a government or a rulership from its place and replaced it with another system. The times where a revolution actually did happen was because it happened at the hands of the elites. And when I say elites, I don't mean people with money. I mean people who occupy very high posts. I mean people who actually have the mental freedom to say, I'm done with this situation and I'm taking this further. So when the elite of any rulership decide to actually revolt and turn their backs on it, that's the end of the rulership then and there. The question is what comes after. So what I want to say as a conclusion to this question is that we, the civilian human beings of our world, must and will reclaim the power of response to any incomprehensibly ghastly crimes from any agenda-driven government and their allies. That is the power of the people who occupy those posts, who occupy the thought leading and the workmanship leading. Human dignity and human responsiveness are gonna have to start to begin to prevail over state-led terror and systemic drama. And I would love to say, watch Lebanon take the heat on that front. I would love to say, because this is what we are working on. And we have a golden opportunity right now to not just inspire movement in the face of callous systemic awfulness in the country. But we will be an example, we can be an example for the entire world where every single country struggles with the same systemic problems. You can do it if the powerful posts decide to turn their backs on the status quo. The worst thing, the only thing that works against any change is the idea that we are powerless and therefore hopeless. So that is the main thing that needs to take a back seat to the power of this type of leadership.
And, you know, when we're talking about trying to move Lebanon forward, although it might seem again like a sort of simplistic way of putting it, but, you know, we're getting a lot of questions about actual physical reconstruction. And Hashem, you know, you were talking about this at the beginning when you gave your presentation. I mean, practically speaking, you know, will Lebanese companies be able to benefit from the reconstruction that is eventually going to be happening? How do you get this city that has been through so much, at least physically, on its feet? And unfortunately, we're very short for time, so I need you to keep your answer.
All I can say is that the efforts, as exemplified by the speakers here, are impressive on the ground. And the grassroots movements are mobilizing to help in the reconstruction efforts. What is lacking is a coordination across those different efforts and bringing them together to create something bigger than the sum total of the individual efforts. Usually it's the state that does that, but a corrupt state, as has been stated again and again, is not able to do that, is not interested in doing that. And therefore, it's incumbent upon us as individual groups and entities to come together to create platforms for exchange and coordination. That is very, very much needed right now.
Yeah, and I know, you know, from my own friends who have had, you know, their homes destroyed down there, you know, they're either basically coughing up out of pocket for reconstruction, or actually in one case, Maya, your organization stepped in to help out a friend of mine. So for everyone who's watching right now, I just want to do a quick round robin where you all, I'm sorry, only have a minute to put out, you know, what you feel people need to know and a call to action. What can people who are watching and listening who want to help actually do? And Hashem, I'll start with you and then go in the same order that you all went in speakers, please, as speakers.
I do think we all need to come together to be aware of what is going on. Knowledge of what is going on in terms of the reconstruction is going to be extremely helpful. So whoever has the capacity to build that knowledge base will be extremely important at this point.
Thank you, Sarah.
To build on what I was saying in my theory introduction, or when I spoke earlier, to talk about justice is no longer a theoretical dream. Justice is not something that's only written about in poems and in Hollywood movies of vengeance. Justice is the most basic human concept. And there are very specific clauses of law that we can follow, and we are currently following. And I really urge every single person who is listening right now to stay tuned and ask how they can actually join the fight for this justice, because in international law, in Lebanese law, in American law, in English law, all of these elements will be held accountable in all of these jurisdictions. This is not just we're going to just toss it in the dark and see if it'll hit something. It's very clear. It's very precise. It's one of the most compelling cases in today's world, and we are going to follow up on that. And we would really love it if you joined the ranks.
Thank you, Sarah. And Maya, for you, how can people help?
I think the role of the diaspora is even more important than they think. The diaspora until now has been doing an amazing job. They've been funding everything that's happening, all the reconstruction. It's 99% coming from the diaspora. But they need to be more involved in putting pressure. It might be on the international community, on the press, whoever has links. I mean, so many Lebanese from the international diaspora are extremely well connected and they're brilliant. They have the power to put pressure on some decision makers. And I think this is what's very important now, because we have to consider that the Lebanese people now are being held hostage under arms, because there is an armed terrorist party in Lebanon that is holding us under siege. So we cannot do anything from here. We need the help of the diaspora.
Thank you, Gregory.
I would like to speak about the youth, the young generation. I think a lot of them, because I teach at ALBA, the Lebanese Academy of Fine Arts, and I am a lot in touch with these people who are in their 20s, and I think that it's very challenging for them, but I think that they have a privilege over our generation, that they are very, very, very conscious. Now, I don't know what they will be able to do, but I have a lot of hopes on them. And I would say that we must do everything possible to let this new generation be able to take over their country back.
Thank you. We do put a lot of pressure on the youth, don't we?
Yeah.
Speaking of youth, yes.
I would join the kind of the Maya's call, basically the role of the diaspora and also as well the youth. I think generally, I think that the main problem that has riddled Lebanon across the many years is that a lot of the fixes and the involvement of people that are willing to help as NGOs used to happen without necessarily any political direction, which the government loves. The government loves it when, you know, the civil society fixes the problems they should be doing, and they just keep on power sharing. I think what's important is beyond just fixing the technical stuff, it's exactly what Maya was saying, is like not acknowledging the legitimacy of the traditional political structures for the youth, not only to fund, or for expats, not only to fund technical initiatives that are fixing things on the ground, but also political initiatives, media initiatives that are able to shed the light, keep the same anger going, and also make sure that whatever civil society is doing translates politically into taking over the state's institutions and eventually institutionalizing this civil society, so that we live in a nation that is able to always keep on perpetuating a positive cycle, not just be a momentary, like we fixed the explosion post-blast, and then we go to what we were living for the past 20 years.
Thank you all so much for sharing your experiences, your time, and your hard work. And if I could just end it by saying to the audience, you know, I know a lot of this, when you're an outsider, can seem like it's overwhelming, like the problems plaguing one country are just, you know, too much and too complicated. But at the very core of it, we have examples in front of us today of 5 individuals on slightly different tracks who are all trying to work towards something. And at the end of the day, it's all these smaller pieces coming together that will end up building a greater good. So even if it does seem overwhelming, know that no amount of support is too small, no action is too insignificant. And I hope for, you know, those of you who aren't necessarily entrenched in what's happening in Lebanon, this has motivated you to try to learn more and share what you have learned here. And once again, from me, thank you all for joining us. Thank you to all of our panelists. It's been such a pleasure spending the last hour plus with all of you. And Daisy, I'll toss it back to you now.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you to this extraordinary and illustrious group of people who've spoken so passionately to us this evening. And I think just brought the whole story of Beirut so vividly into everyone's homes watching. I think everyone has been deeply affected and inspired by what they've heard. And we're just very grateful at 5 by 15 to the Voices for Lebanon group and for the committee who've steered us through and supported us so much. It was completely their inspiration, and I hope that they will organize many, many more events and continue to really raise awareness of what's going on, and also what we can all do to be involved and to be part of a new chapter. So for now, it's good night from all of us at 5 by 15. It's thank you to everybody for attending. I know there's a huge virtual round of applause happening, and we are just very, very grateful. Thank you, Awa, for your brilliant chairing. And thank you to Hashim, to Sarah, to Maya, Gregory, and Yazan. We will do a follow-up email tomorrow, so you will get some information about organizations. And from all of us, good night. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.